Hello my friends, and welcome to our video lecture on topic B4.2, ecological niches. Our guiding questions for today: what are the advantages of specialized modes of nutrition to living organisms, and how are the adaptations of a species related to its niche in an ecosystem? And our objectives for today: we're going to define ecological niche. What even is that? We're going to talk about modes of nutrition with so many examples. We're going to look at aerobes and anaerobes, autotrophs, heterotrophs, and mixotrophs. We're going to distinguish between obligate and facultative modes of nutrition. We're also going to talk about some of the adaptations that organisms have to take advantage of their nutritional niches. We're going to look at how herbivores and predators have adaptations so that they can feed. We're also going to look at adaptations that plants and prey have against feeding by those herbivores and predators. We're going to distinguish between fundamental and realized niches, and then wrap up with a look at the competitive exclusion principle. So what even is an ecological niche? It's the role that an organism plays in its ecosystem. That role is going to depend a little bit on the habitat. The habitat provides those abiotic factors needed for survival. If you want a reminder, here they are. But we're looking at not just where the organism lives, but how it interacts with the other organisms around it, and also those abiotic factors in the ecosystem. This is often related to nutrition. So we're going to talk a lot about nutrition in this video, thinking about habitat, those abiotic factors, thinking about the community, the other organisms with which the organisms are interacting. Interestingly, lots of organisms, lots of species can inhabit the same habitat, but generally only one species can occupy any given niche. One of the most fundamental distinctions in modes of nutrition is the requirement of oxygen. Anaerobes do not require oxygen. Aerobes do require oxygen. Anaerobes are going to live in places where there is no oxygen. We're going to call those anoxic or without oxygen environments, whereas our aerobes live in environments that do have oxygen. Those are called oxic. Interestingly, some anaerobes are what we call obligate. Examples are the bacteria that causes tetanus, and then methanogenic archaebacteria. These guys take CO2 and turn it into methane. These guys will die if they are in an environment that has oxygen. So they are obligated to live in places without oxygen. We call them obligate anaerobes. Other organisms are obligate aerobes. We are obligate aerobes. We have to live in environments that do have oxygen. No oxygen, we die. That's bad. So we are obligated, or obligate aerobes, obligated to live in environments with oxygen. There are some facultative anaerobes. Facultative means optional. So if there's some oxygen around, they'll survive and they'll use the oxygen to produce the ATP that they required. But also if there's not oxygen around, they have a backup plan. They can also live in those anoxic environments. Some examples are E. coli. This is a bacteria that is very commonly found in our intestines. And then this is the fungus that we call yeast, most commonly. Another way for us to categorize modes of nutrition is by looking at autotrophs versus heterotrophs. Auto means self, hetero means different or other, troph means food or nutrition. So autotrophs, which is what all of the organisms on this slide are self-feeders. These guys happen to all be photosynthesizers. Photosynthesis is one way that organisms can make their own food. So photosynthesizers are autotrophs. Here we have plants. Plants are mostly photosynthetic and therefore autotrophs. We have here algae that happens to be a protist. Remember that protists are single-celled organisms. So sometimes we think they're bacteria, but they're not bacteria because they have membrane-bound organelles, including a nucleus. So protists, single-celled eukaryotic organisms. We also have some bacteria that can carry out photosynthesis. These guys happen to be cyanobacteria. So lots of different kingdoms of organisms can be autotrophs, These ones happen to carry out their autotrophy via photosynthesis. Autotrophs are self-feeders. Heterotrophs are other feeders. We feed on other organisms in order to get the carbon-containing organic molecules that we need. Some heterotrophs are also holozoic. We humans are holozoic. These amoeba, which are also protists, eukaryotic single-celled organisms, also holozoic. So here's an amoeba ingesting a food particle. Step 1. Step 2, we're going to add some enzymes to digest that food particle. Step 2, we do that digestion in our stomachs and small intestines. Step 3, once digestion is done, we can absorb the nutrients that we were able to get out of the food particles. We do that also in our small intestines. Once those nutrients are in our bodies, we can assimilate them. That means that we're using them to build our own bodies. When I eat a cheeseburger, I'm going to break down the protein in the cheeseburger into amino acids. I absorb those amino acids into my body, and then I use those amino acids to build my own proteins. Building my own proteins, that's assimilation. Finally, egestion. This is dumping out the pieces of the food particles that were not digestible or not usable. This is our having a bowel movement. The amoeba dumping stuff out in a different kind of vesicle. Amoeba, these protists, are holozoic heterotrophs, so are we humans. This earthworm, also holozoic. It's going to dig in the dirt, ingest the dirt, digest the dirt, absorb nutrients out of the dirt, assimilate those nutrients, and then egest whatever pieces of the dirt were not digestible or absorbable. What's kind of cool about this earthworm is that we also consider it to be a decomposer. Because it's not necessarily eating like fresh plant, it's eating partially decayed, already partially decomposed organic matter from dead organisms. We call that detritus. Detritus is that partially broken down matter from dead organisms. Because earthworms and other kinds of decomposers who are holozoic eat this detritus, we're going to call them detritivores. They literally dig in the dirt, eat the dirt, digest the dirt, and then absorb, assimilate dirt. And the detritus, that organic matter from dead organisms, that's in the dirt. Another kind of decomposer is a saprotroph. Fungi and bacteria are saprotrophs. They do not ingest anything. They are not at all holozoic like the earthworm or us humans. Instead, what they do is they secrete enzymes outside their bodies. Digestion occurs externally, outside their bodies. Once that digestion occurs, for decomposers like mushroom, it is detritus that they are externally digesting. They'll go ahead and absorb, assimilate, and egest. But because those first two steps did not occur inside their bodies, they are not holozoic. Super cool thing about these spiders are what we call saprozoic. They also are not holozoic. They do not ingest their prey. Instead, they wrap it up in some spider silk. They inject enzymes that will digest that prey outside the spider's body. And then once this organism, this prey, has been literally turned into like nutrient soup, the spider will take in just that soupy nutrient stuff. So because digestion occurs externally, they're not considered holozoic. Instead, they are kind of like a fungus or a bacteria, saprozoic. What if you are both a little bit autotrophic and heterotrophic? Well, we call you a mixotroph. So these are organisms that can both make their own food and also feed off of other organisms. Can be both heterotrophic and autotrophic at the same time. This guy is Euglena, another protist single-celled eukaryotic organism. Euglena is what we call a facultative mixotroph. It has the option to do both photosynthesis and ingestion of food particles. It can carry out photosynthesis when light is readily available. If it happens to be living in a super cloudy pond, or not a lot of sunlight is available for other reasons, weather, whatnot, then it can ingest food particles and carry out some heterotrophic nutrition. It is facultative. It has the option to do both. Another organism, this Venus flytrap, is an obligate mixotroph. It has to do both autotrophy and heterotrophy. The autotrophy is how it is going to get the glucose that it needs, those carbohydrates that are produced in photosynthesis. However, Venus flytraps live in boggy land where the nitrogen levels are very low. And so to make up for that nitrogen deficiency, they also are heterotrophs. They eat bugs, they digest these bugs in order to get the nitrogen that they need, that they cannot get from the soil. They have to be mixotrophs, therefore they are obligate, as opposed to facultative, optional. A few slides ago, toward the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned an example of an Archaebacteria as an example of an obligate anaerobe, that methanogenic Archaea that uses carbon dioxide to produce methane in its nutritional pathways. Archaebacteria are pretty cool. They display a lot of diversity in their modes of nutrition. Just a quick look at what even are Archaebacteria. So we have this domain Archaea. These bacteria, they are prokaryotic, no nuclei, no membrane-bound organelles, but they're not exactly like the common bacteria that we think of, so they have their very own domain. Here we have our common ancestor. Remember, we talked a long time ago about LUCA, that last universal common ancestor. Archaebacteria, though, are maybe a little bit more similar to eukaryotes than they are to all the other bacteria. These guys live in extreme environments. They like methane, they like big heat, they might like super salty things. They can be phototrophic, using light energy to make their own food, or they can be chemotrophic, using chemical energy to make their own food. That's what's happening here in this deep sea vent. There are Archaebacteria living there, floor of the ocean, no light, except for clearly here we shined a light to take the picture. But they're using the chemical energy of these deep sea vents in order to produce their own food. Because they're making their own food, they are autotrophic, even though they're not photosynthetic. And there are also some Archaebacteria that are heterotrophic, needing to get their organic compounds from other organisms. Archaebacteria and their modes of nutrition give us lots of information about evolution. Dentition, or the patterns of teeth in organisms, also can give us lots of information about the evolution of life on Earth, especially us animals. So we can look at these different patterns of teeth in carnivores, herbivores, and then we humans are an example of an omnivore, eating many things. We can look at these patterns of teeth to deduce or figure out what we eat. Carnivores' teeth are going to be super sharp. They're going to have these molars that kind of interlock in order to shred meat. Herbivores, not so much in terms of fangs. They're going to have these super crunchy molars that help to grind up the food matter. Us omnivores have a little bit of both. We're going to have some sharp teeth toward the front of our mouths, some grinding molars in the back so that we can eat both that meat and also some plant matter. And what's super cool is that we can compare the dentition, patterns of teeth, in these known organisms to fossilized organisms, and we can deduce the diets of extinct species by comparing dentition. Herbivores, plant-eating organisms, have those super cool molars that help them grind up plant matter, but there are some herbivores that don't have any teeth because they're bugs. They have some other super cool adaptations that allow them to feed off of plants. One example of an adaptation of these herbivorous insects is to have these chewing adaptations. Beetles are an example of chewers. They're literally going to chew up the plant matter. Some organisms like aphids instead have piercing and sucking adaptations. They're going to stick these stylets into the phloem of plants and suck the sap out of them. Others are sucking adaptations. These are going to be our butterflies, and they're going to send these tongues down to suck nectar out of the plants. And even though plants definitely want butterflies to come and suck the nectar, because this is how pollination is going to occur, plants do not want beetles eating their leaves or aphids sucking out their sap. So quite a few plants have adaptations against herbivory. How are they going to prevent animals from eating them? Stinging nettle is an example of a plant that has some pretty serious adaptations. All of these super sharp spines are not going to feel good in the mouths of animals as they eat them. They also have some super irritating chemicals. We humans, if we brush against them, it does not feel good. Here we've got some milkweed. Milkweed produces a toxin in its plants, in its stems and leaves, that most animals are going to find super not tasty, and so few organisms are going to feed off of milkweed. This monarch butterfly caterpillar is a big exception. It has some adaptations against the toxins in the milkweed. Predators also have lots of adaptations to allow them to more easily hunt and eat their prey. Some of those adaptations are structural. The structure of the teeth in this vampire bat, super sharp incisors and canines, allows it to pierce the prey that it is hunting. It doesn't have any molars because it doesn't need to chew anything. This allows the vampire bat, again, to pierce its prey and then drink blood. There are some chemical adaptations. This venomous snake, the venom is actually a neurotoxin that paralyzes its prey, makes it super easy to eat it when it cannot move. Some adaptations are behavioral. This grizzly bear has evolved this behavior to stand in the river during salmon breeding season. And as the salmon are migrating, it just stands there and catches them as the salmon try to swim upriver. And of course, if predators have adaptations, prey do as well. Those adaptations in prey can be structural. The structure of this moth, its wings, its body are colored for optimal camouflage. It's super hard to see these moths when they sit on the tree bark that matches their own coloration. Some adaptations of prey can be chemical. Here's that same monarch butterfly caterpillar that we looked at a couple slides ago. It feeds on the milkweed. The milkweed has a toxin. That caterpillar actually accumulates the toxin from the milkweed in its own body, which means that it does not taste good to anything that wants to eat it. And there are also lots of behavioral adaptations against predators. Here, this lovely group of meerkat are watching out for predators, and then they will make sounds to try to warn the rest of the group if there is a predator around. And of course, plants also have adaptations to be successful in their ecological niches. They're producers. They need access to sunlight. And so trees are adapted to grow super tall. They're going to add lots of lignin to their xylem to have the support to be tall. The taller you are, the less likely you are to be shaded by other organisms. Lianas are vines. They're not going to invest in lignified xylem. Instead, they use other plants, those trees, as support to grow tall so they can get to that sunlight. Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. An example is an orchid. So this guy literally just growing on top of the branch of these other trees. They're not parasites. They're not sucking nutrients out of the tree. They're just using the height of the tree to get access to light. Some epiphytes, though, are not so lovely as an orchid. Some epiphytes are what we call strangler epiphytes. They literally outgrow the branches of the tree that they are living on, preventing that tree from being able to carry out photosynthesis in its leaves. That's going to lead to the death of the tree, but that epiphyte is still living on the skeleton of the tree, so it still has lots of access to light. And then some plants are adapted to just deal with less light. So our shade-tolerant plants, herbs, and shrubs that live on the forest floor don't need quite as intense sunlight to carry out photosynthesis. Our ecological niches, those roles that we fulfill in an ecosystem that depend on all those abiotic factors and also the interactions that we have with the communities in our ecosystems, can be classified as fundamental or realized. Fundamental niches are the whole entire space that an organism, a species, could inhabit. All the abiotic factors required for survival are there. However, there are always going to be some pieces of our fundamental niches that have high levels of competition, and that competition might make it impossible for the species to actually occupy that part of the niche. And so we have this other thing that we call the realized niche, where the organism really lives. Fundamental could, realized actually does, due to competition making it difficult for us to live in that habitat, or we might need some other organisms, host organisms, that might not be present in the whole entire fundamental niche. Which brings us to our final little piece of this video lecture, the idea of a competitive exclusion principle. Habitats can be shared by communities. Niches are unique to species. And so we cannot have more than one species in the same ecological niche. This is the idea of there's some competition which is going to exclude some species from some ecological niches. An investigation was done of 2 species of Paramecium. Remember that Paramecium, one of those protist organisms, so single-celled eukaryotic organism, these guys live in ponds. If we had one of those species, this guy all by itself, super happy, notice our sigmoidal curve, and then we're getting to our carrying capacity. If I've got this other species all by itself, similar-ish curve, lots of initial growth, and then we get to our carrying capacity. What if we try to put both of these species in the same ecological niche, in the same environment? We grow them together. So there's initially a little bit of growth from both species because there's not a lot of competition since there are so few numbers. But then the Paramecium aurelia absolutely outcompetes the other guy. And then there is no this Paramecium species in that niche because of competition. And so this is, again, the competitive exclusion principle. 2 species cannot occupy the same niche because competition. And hopefully, my friends, you feel like you can answer our guiding questions. Advantages of specialized modes of nutrition allow us to take advantage of those unique niches in an ecosystem. We accomplished all of these objectives. We talked about ecological niche, that role that species play in their ecosystem. Lots of different modes of nutrition related to those niches. We have aerobes, anaerobes. We have autotrophs, heterotrophs, those super cool mixotrophs. We have both obligate and facultative different modes of feeding. We talked about some of the adaptations that we have to take advantage of those nutritional niches. Herbivores and predators have specialized adaptations to feed. Plants and prey have adaptations to prevent that feeding. We talked about the difference between fundamental and realized niches, and we outlined that competitive exclusion principle. Great work today, my friends.